Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Bridge podcast where medicine meets the arts. This podcast comes out of a 9-week narrative medicine program called The Bridge, where each week we explore what it means to listen and read and live more attentively. Last week, we talked a little bit about figurative language and how figurative language, like metaphors and symbols, make meaning. How, for example, a metaphor or a symbol can give pain a real embodied, felt sense in the ear of the listener. What does it taste like? What does it feel like? What does it look like to the person experiencing it? This week we turn to perspective and bias, and we do that because if metaphors help us carry meaning across from one person to another, bias also asks us, what lenses are we bringing as we listen? How do our assumptions and our own self stories impact the way we hear others? How should it impact the way we hear others? Our close reading text for this week was the opening passage of Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, which is a work famous for its unreliable narrator. This voice is contradictory, it's defensive, it's painfully self-aware and yet not self-aware at all. He calls himself spiteful, sick, unattractive, then immediately admits to exaggeration and self-deception. He tries to give an account of himself, but in doing so, he shows us how impossible that task really is. So for me, the guiding questions for the week were, what does it mean to be an unreliable narrator? Can anyone ever truly give a reliable account of themselves? And if every story has gaps or contradictions, how should that shape the way we receive stories? So today I am joined by Amy Leapheart, a professor of English and Medical Humanities who lives in Charleston, South Carolina, and teaches in Bluffton. Amy spends a lot of time on the road across the South Carolina Lowcountry and an even greater amount of time encouraging students to discover the power of narrative in their own lives. She also finds joy in swimming and teaching fitness classes and lessons that help kids and adults find healthier rhythms. Amy, welcome. I'd love to start by asking you, what drew you to narrative medicine?
I was an avid reader as a child. I we moved a lot, and so every time we would move, especially if we would move in the summertime, and it would take a while before you would make friends, the library was always there. And so I would come home with stacks and stacks of books. And I didn't really think of that as being unusual. It seemed like that was a big part of my life, and so it should be a big part of everyone's life. As I went through high school and college, I gravitated towards an English degree, but early on, I decided I wanted to teach English at the college level. And that's when I started discovering that not everybody felt the same passion for reading that I do. And that was a bit of a tough lesson to learn. And so one of the things that I started focusing on was, the power of the story, helping students to see how when we share our stories with each other, that's in essence what writing is. You're sharing of yourself. And I found that students were really engaged with each other's stories, and that kind of opened the door a little bit to more appreciation for reading. But, you know, over the years, as I tried to convince my students of the power of narrative, I kept kind of circling back to the way that narrative is used. Basically, I took a little bit of time away from teaching English composition, found myself teaching in health professions and medical school, and because I wanted a break from teaching writing, and ended up finding that story is critical across every facet of life. And so I went back to teaching undergrads, and I was able to say, look, even when you are planning to be a physician or a nurse or a physical therapist, you're going to have to understand and analyze story. You're going to have to um, look not just at what's being said, but also the void in the story, what's not being shared, because that for someone in clinical is important. What is not being shared, and so I really use that awareness to help my students understand how that is. At this stage, I move into narrative across all professions. That's one a good percentage of my students for the first year classes are students that are health related professions, but I also have from students from marine biology, and in every single profession, they're doing story. You use story to educate, to inform, persuade. You use story to understand. And so that is kind of like the baseline of my educational pursuits and dynamics. And then over the years, that has led to a significant appreciation of the power of health story, of public health students, some nursing students, and um, we start our semester with a health narrative. And I always have this kind of one-on-one Zoom meeting with a student to give them feedback.
Mm.
And I ask, why do you think, if so many of your classes are evidence-based, traditional research of writing, why do you think in this class we spend time on narrative? And their answer is, I think, appropriate to kind of what we're covering in this, is that I am looking for their perspective, their story. And they are absolutely right. And I support that answer and encourage them. But I also say narrative is one of the most important tools you can have as a health writer. You need to be able to elicit the health stories from others, and you need to be able to use those health stories to support a larger community. And so, and I say that's something that we don't always cover in our writing classes, is the power of narrative. And so, that I think for me, and then on top of that, I get the pleasure of hearing stories and seeing, what they're struggling with, but giving them that voice. And our class becomes a community because there's a lot of peer review where they share stories with each other. And it's one of the things that I think is a really exceptional experience for the students, not just sharing their own story, but sharing their story in a space where they're going to also see other students' stories.
Beautifully said. Yeah, I identify with so much of that I kind of want to go back and unpack it piece by piece. First of all, it really hits home for me, this itinerant childhood where you just found books as the one constant, the library as the one constant. I think it might be a prerequisite or something for English teachers everywhere to have been that lone child sitting there reading reading a book. I distinctly remember I moved around a lot in high school, and I distinctly remember, being too scared to go sit out in the lunchroom. Lunchrooms are scary places as a kid because you have to decide where to sit, and that is just, that's terrifying in a new school. So I remember just sitting in the bathroom with my lunch and my book and being perfectly happy there. So that really speaks to me. And yet, ironically, as you've already so eloquently said, story is a communal act. Reading might be a solitary experience, but sharing story is a community one. You are reading that book alongside many other invisible readers, and the conversation that we get to have in this space um, is really a luxury that I never got to have as a child, to be able to talk story with you guys. You also said that, as you were teaching English, you started to understand the power of story, specifically the way that narrative was used. And I love the way that you describe story as not some hyper specialized or intellectual field. It can be, but it is also something that's intrinsically human, so maybe even definitionally human. We tell stories all the time,
Mhm, mhm,
whether we want to or not. And whether or not we're aware of it. And maybe it's our job as teachers to make ourselves primarily and others more aware of it. How do we tell the story? So I
mhm,
really loved that point.
mhm,
And as you also brought up, there is agency there. When we can really tap into
mhm.
the way we tell a story, we tap into our own agency. I don't want to backtrack too much, but Audre Lorde last week talked a lot about the power of agency in storytelling too. So what a bright way for us to start this podcast today. Um, so I want to jump right on in to the text that we looked at this week, Notes from Underground by Dostoevsky. Have you read any of this before? Was this your first time with those first two pages we looked at?
Yes, first time. So that was um it was an interesting text, because I found myself having initial reactions and then having a shift.
Mhm.
But I think that the narrator also has a shift. And so um I I was surprised at having had colleagues in past roles that were extremely kind of a negative person. I felt this um, familiarity with, a bit of a negative mindset. And then it was amazing where, there was this shift and I thought to myself, I don't know that this person is really that focused on being negative. It
Mm.
felt very much like it was a reaction to maybe perceived vulnerabilities, or, I think in my post, I may have said, uncertainty and confusion about status and self-worth. And so I found that the writing itself was really rich in the way that you could um, look at it from different perspectives and have different reactions. And I think that played out in the discussion board posts, right? People talking about how they had slightly different reactions to the narrator. So,
Yeah, this is a I was about to say this is usually a polarizing narrator in that people get into it or they don't, but it's not even polarizing. Usually people 9 times out of 10 are just like, I do not like this guy. He's
yeah,
tough to like.
yeah,
He wants to
yeah,
be
yeah,
likable, right? Like
yeah,
he's
yeah.
asking out of us. And I loved how in your close reading, rather than take the bait, of just disliking him or expecting something from him, you really leaned into the defense mechanisms at work here. As you said, the reactions to his perceived vulnerabilities. So you really did a deeper look than most folks do. And I'd love to talk about that. You wrote that the narrator exudes negativity, but is also deeply aware of his own shame. And I really noticed that too, shame being like this pivotal kind of almost the foundation of all of these feelings. How do you see shame?
Hmm. Hmm. Say that again, please. I lost you for a second.
That's okay. How do you see shame at work in these two pages? Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, the way that he discusses, at some point, he says that he is shameless.
Hmm.
And then he talks, though, about having that shame. And, um, but he doesn't really identify what it's rooted in. All we really get from him is this um, disconcerting back and forth where, I mean, even the language is challenging, where he says, I'm not at
Right.
some point, and it becomes quite a
We've lost Amy for just a second. It looks like she's jumping back on. There we are.
sorry about that.
Nice.
But yeah, like I said, we're testing out my hotspot, so we'll see how well that goes. So, but yeah, I mean, the language that and I think there's another one or two people in our group that talked about archaic language, but even it's more than just that. It's the double negative and the I'm not spiteful, or you know, um it was hard to follow, which just to me gave me that sense of um the the narrator being confused, unsure, kind of like pushing out. But when somebody pushes in that way, it's so often a defensive reaction. But yet we don't really know what is the shame that the author is feeling. I mean, he talks about disease and illness. There is a sense that his inner mind is really uh, kind of affecting his health, but yet he will not go see a doctor about this. These are all things that he asserts, but yet won't necessarily go talk to someone about or seek
Hmm.
guidance. So, but that shame comment that he makes a couple of times is it it's somewhat buried, and so but it is the one thing that really would explain this kind of defensive um blustery talk, and also that kind of, if this was a student paper, I would say, hey, maybe not start every sentence with I.
Yeah.
You know, so
Right.
so, and I'm not saying I felt that way. It's just it's a style of writing. You can talk about yourself without necessarily saying I. But I think this narrator was illustrative of um, how the way we speak and the way we discuss ourselves can reveal things that we might not even realize about ourselves.
Hmm. Yeah, and You point out so many instances where this is happening in the language that maybe this speaker doesn't even realize, but it's in the words themselves. You mentioned the double negatives, the back and forths, the starting every sentence with an I, and how much that might reveal if we were in workshop with him and he was reading this story to us, we might be able to reflect to him the things that we're noticing here that he might not see. And so we as readers kind of get this vantage of a blind spot, and yet there's something I find really, I don't know, interesting about this, the way this narrator exposes me to my own blind spots too. You know, he there's so much off the page about his context that I just don't know. But the fact that shame keeps coming up over and over again makes me think, okay, there's something happening socially here. And he keeps posturing this, he keeps imagining this reader, he even uses that you voice, now he says, now are not
Yes.
fancying, gentlemen, that I am expressing remorse for something now, that I am asking your forgiveness for something. I assure you, I am sure you're fancying that. However, I assure you, I do not care if you are. He's imagining this
Yeah.
reader that, of course, makes us wonder, who is he talking to, and what are the social roots of
Hmm.
this shame? And still,
Hmm.
even as he is talking, uh, in all of these back and forth ways, contradicting himself, saying one thing and then saying the exact opposite, he's actually pretty honest about his limitations. He says, he feels all of these things swarming in him, all of these emotions, these opposing elements that have been swarming in him all his life and craving some outlet for me. But he doesn't know what they are. He can't let them out.
Hmm.
God forbid he let them out.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
he reduces them all to this feeling of shame. They tormented me till I was ashamed. So in a way,
Hmm.
he's telling his narrative the best, most reliable way he can by being honest about his
Right.
reliability, which I just find really interesting.
Hmm.
And that brings
Hmm.
me to your brilliant observation that this is an unreliable narrator. And you invited us in your close reading to interrogate that term further, and I'd love to take you up on that here. You said the unreliable narrator is a term that we should question and peel off the layers of its meaning and implications. And I'd love to hear you talk about that.
Yeah. I mean, the stories that I've told across my life shift.
Yeah.
I might tell the same story over and over again. And depending on what lens or perspective, what's going on in my life, it still can be the same sequence of events that I'm relaying. But if I'm 5 years older or 10 years older, 20 years older, it changes slightly. And so, uh, you know, I think an unreliable narrator as a literary device or something that happens within narratives is a way for us to kind of question the constancy of story, that story evolves and shifts and it can be fluid. And that's an important consideration. Oh my gosh. So 2 weeks ago, maybe, um, was the person on the podcast Justin?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So I absolutely loved so in that podcast, he was talking about team-based healthcare. And that's part of what I did when I worked at the Medical University of South Carolina. I loved hearing all about that. And it's so important, that work that is described in that podcast and in their practice is incredible. But he talked about how across the different members of the team across different professions,
Yeah.
that they would sometimes get slightly different stories. And then they also, same patient, but
Yeah.
yet slightly different stories.
Right.
Um, and they would also, have different interpretations of the stories. The patient's story. And I think that's really important for us to recognize, is that um, we're going to adjust our story, whether it's consciously or unconsciously, depending on the audience, but also, depending on where we are at that moment with our confidence or our feelings of vulnerability or our feelings of um, like what we need. And so that can shape our story. And so the unreliable narrator is something that is discussed, and it's a helpful thing for students to understand. But I think we've got to make sure that they understand who, they've got to question who says what is reliable. And, is there a greater purpose in having someone that's unreliable?
Hmm.
Um, One of the films that I show in my medical humanities class is Proof. And it's also a play. Uh, the person that wrote the play also wrote the um, screenplay. And so David Alburn had this opportunity to to do things in the film that he wasn't necessarily able to do in the play. And one of the things that I love about this play, and one of the reasons that we study it, because we look at both parts, the are both um, the play and the film, is that um, there are some scenes that are added to the film that really heighten the main character's name is Catherine, and it really heightens uh, Catherine's mental distress.
Yeah.
There's a scene, her father, she's been taking care of, she's been a caretaker. It's about the caretaker experience. And the film opens up with classic signs of someone experiencing depression.
Yeah.
But she also is, questioning her own mental stability, mainly because her father struggled with mental illness. And so she worries about it being hereditary. And so all of this is included in this play and film. But the playwright um, really ratchets up that sense of her mental instability in the film in ways that doesn't happen in the play. It's a product of what you can achieve when you're telling a story through film. You have flashbacks. She has classic textbook signs of depression, but then she has this um, verbal outburst in the middle of her father's funeral where she says, "I'm glad he's dead." So we, as the audience, kind of question her mental stability. We question the whole premise of the play is whether or not she actually wrote this mathematical groundbreaking proof, which is why it's called a proof. And so the whole um, series of scenes is meant to make us question not just her mental stability, but also whether or not she could have done this, or did she literally steal her father's work? And so there's so many layers in this piece. But the bottom line is, without her elements of mental instability being present, we wouldn't really understand the impact of being a caregiver.
Mhm.
If
Yeah.
we didn't have those moments where, the playwright pushes us to question her, then we wouldn't be able to really question what happened to her.
Right.
Right. So,
Yeah. As you're talking, I'm hearing two different approaches to unreliability that I think are both really worth talking about and focusing on. On one level, we have this kind of the unintentionally unreliable narrator that we all are. That is, you know, because our stories shift according to memory, according to audience, according to our how we're feeling right now, if we feel vulnerable, if we get what we need, as you said. Um, this unreliable narrator that we all are, tells different stories to different people, all of which are some version of true, but might be wildly different because we all contain multitudes, right? I'm really struggling with this one right now because I'm mostly my writing is poetry, but I've just decided to start venturing into this crazy world of memoir. And as I'm writing this, I'm like, you have to make so many leaps to fill the gaps, and at some points it's pure fiction, and I'm like, well, do I just call this fiction at this point, and I realize maybe the story I'm telling is unfair because it's just from my perspective, and if I really told this from a more global perspective, it might be more honest. And all of these questions really bring to light this unintentional unreliable narrator that I am, and bring real issues of ethics to the foreground. And then the second approach that you talk about is this intentionally unreliable narrator on the part of the author, which makes artwork very interesting and maybe a very accurate description of what it means to be this, this fallible human. You mentioned that the play with somebody who's has heightened mental distress and depression, and it helps me to think about this. You asked the question, is there a greater purpose to the unreliability? And it made me realize that in a lot of artwork, how do we tell whether somebody is lying or going, off the rails a little bit, maybe not seeing reality clearly? We have to have a counterpoint within the text that shows us, or at least suggests to us, what the reality is, so that we can question the discrepancy, right? Like, so there has to be something within the text itself that allows us to surmise as readers that, hey, something's a little bit off here. So in a sense, the author gets to play God a little bit and say, even if it's by just suggestion, hey, this is what reality really is. But we don't have that vantage in reality. There is no capital T truth or capital R reality in the world out there. We get it within a book. But in real life, it's really hard to see a real. All we can do is kind of triangulate real together. So the way that these different kinds of unreliable narrators work, whether it's just this human unreliability or it's kind of intentional on the part of the author to expose us to our own intrinsic, unreliability, both exist in this text right here. Um, we have this character who is very, at one point I can see, on one hand, I can see how Dostoevsky is using him to kind of have a larger argument about, how slippery that slope is toward solipsism, which I would love to talk with you about in a second. But on the other hand,
mhm.
I also see a part of myself in him. I see that constant quest, that constant attempt to figure out who you are, and then the rejection of the whole project because it's futile anyway,
That's right. That's right.
Feel it.
So, yeah.
So I want to talk to you about this great comment that you made about solipsism. You described the fear that too much self-exploration might collapse into solipsism. kind of like how you saw this narrator doing that in this text. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, I mean, um, so okay. Um, I'm trying to remember who it was. It might have, and of course, we just see names on the discussion board, but I think it might have been Merritt. I don't know if I'm pronouncing um, their name correctly, but um, there was a comment that I absolutely loved about, I think it might have been somebody else, maybe Martina. But anyway, it was a comment along the lines of um, they just talked, they were talking about the narrator, and the narrator just talked and talked and talked. I was exhausted. I just wanted them to take a breath. That
Right.
was what,
Yes.
yes. Okay. I loved that. I was like, but, but, all right. So, so the thing is, right, you've got this juxtaposition between um becoming self-aware, but also what we just said about the unreliable narrator is that narrators, everything's shifting. A narrative can shift in someone's life. And so when you are searching through, like when you are doing the work for self-awareness,
Mhm.
right, there is no stationary goalpost because it shifts. And so that for me, sometimes I, um, because of the work that I do with students, because of the work that I do, um, I'm always trying to be as aware as possible.
Mhm.
But I also sometimes find that awareness, uh, the attempts to be self-aware, as somewhat exhausting.
Yeah.
And so, and then when you get into it's kind of like a toddler, right? That gets overtired. You can't calm them down, right? So that is a worry that I have, is that too deep of a look, too much awareness, will we know, just like the toddler doesn't know that it's time to go take a nap, they've become overstimulated.
Mhm.
That's the kind of question I have. At what point do we teeter over into the whole solipsism? Is there a chance that too much awareness, self-awareness, can lead to this kind of um, stream of consciousness with radical contradictions that we had in Dostoevsky's work? That's it. I found that to be kind of fascinating.
Right. I see that happening in like a larger cultural way too. How easily this all of this rhetoric around self-care and self-knowledge slips into narcissism and you know I
Yes.
you know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
Like actually
Yeah.
I think returning to Audre Lorde, I will correct myself in the notes on this if I need to fact check myself, but I think it was Audre Lorde who clarified that the original term for self-care was something she actually coined, and it was about taking care of yourself so you could take care of your community. It wasn't about just bubble baths and treating yourself and spending time, with you. It was about taking care of yourself so that you could be a part of your community and so that you could help others. It was through the self for others. And
It,
yeah,
yeah. The airplane metaphor, right? You put
right,
on your oxygen mask
right.
first so that you can take care of others. And that's why it's important, right?
Right.
Um, too much of anything can be um, you know, a negative thing. So yeah, maybe that is what we're seeing, is this, from those that never experience self-care, then we're seeing this pendulum swing
Right.
to a point where there is an overemphasis on it without a recognition of the real reason why we do it.
Beautifully said. This is a great place for us to pin a conversation that we'll be having in week 8 about caregiving and self-care, where we talk about that tough line to
Mhm.
navigate between the two. Um, and I think sometimes, even if there's not an answer to the question, just the fact of asking the question is helpful, you know? I come up against this all the time in work in narrative medicine with students' work and with my own work. This kind of the way how easily it can slip into just kind of us babbling, and projecting, on onto other stories. But I use the word babble not in the sense that words aren't inherently valuable, but I use the word babble because a lot of times we like to just throw rhetorical words or phrases that we haven't really thought about into the text, and how quickly that slides us into that solipsistic territory when just out of sheer exhaustion with the project, we just kind of write what sounds good, or we project our own assumptions onto the reader because it's hard to sit and listen. It's hard to sit and listen. I do. The irony is not lost on me that I can talk for hours about listening too. That in itself is a kind of narcissism and solipsism that's easy to get trapped in. And yet I think sometimes it's just the question of am I doing this right now is a helpful ethical compass point. And I think you've been asking that question assiduously throughout this conversation and throughout your posts. Thank you for doing that. I actually I left your post, and I said this on the boards this week. I left your posts feeling a real reconnection to that ethical core, as you said, the reason why we do this in the first place. Um,
Mhm.
so I'm gonna wind this up a little bit, but is there anything else that you would like to share about perspective and bias or about Dostoevsky that you think is important for folks to know?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I find so fascinating about the reading is, we all had, whether it was fleeting or ongoing, that reaction to someone who said, I'm not a likable person. And um, I would imagine that that is a true challenge, both from, you know, being an active listener, an attentive listener, um, to to being to interacting with, like, when I interact with students, right? I think I talked about this in one of my posts. What helps me get to the point where I I saw this potential for this vulnerability, this kind of reaction, is that um, the narrator reminded me sometimes of students that will come into a conversation and they will just monopolize the conversation. And for a long time, I operated under what I would consider to be a bias, that was rooted in someone that was extremely confident. And don't get me wrong, that can be the case. But
Mhm.
sometimes, students might do that out of, anxiety, not feeling sure of their place within the classroom or the university or the world in general. They might do that. Um, in other words, a student might be overly talkative that's experiencing the exact same feelings of anxiety and low self-esteem as the student that never says anything, right? In other words, it can play out in different ways. And so I think it's important to, I'm not saying that there's a right or a wrong way to look at this speaker. this narrator. But I think it's important to recognize that we can have different ways to interpret. And I think, again, our very first instinct, which might be rightly placed, is to find this to be a somewhat unlikable character,
Mhm.
for many, many reasons. I mean, the character says, I like to make people unhappy, right? And so, but when we as teachers and as clinicians and just people in the world are always going to be interacting with people who um, feel unlikable.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that we have to um, put ourselves in a bad situation with that person, but maybe it helps to try to understand what could be some underlying reasons um, for that. And so, I think I it's it's really important to recognize that we all have unconscious biases. That is something that we bring to our storytelling, and it's something that we bring to our, narrative analysis. And it's not it it's not there's this article that I do with my students on unconscious bias. It's called Where Bias Begins: The Truth About Stereotypes. And my students, they struggle with it a little bit because one takeaway from it is that it's natural for us to have these biases because our brain wants to classify. And this goes back a little bit to the introductory reading, which talks about the other, like the identity versus the other. And so it's when our brain needs a binary, there's like us versus them. Like if our brain is looking to categorize things, if that's the way our brain, which is what the article kind of says, that our brain is wired that way. um I worry that my students get a little frustrated because there aren't answers in the article. Like it doesn't give a good strong sense of how to combat it. But what I try to get them to understand is that being aware of it, knowing that our brain might try to see, like if our brain looks at things in these dichotomies or these dualities, like this binary, um, we are getting better, I think, at understanding that things don't exist in a binary. That there's uh, uh, gradients, and I mean we see that um, in everything from the way things. I was listening to something the other day about, you know, autism, and how in the beginning it was, there was like this, and now there's a continuum, right? And so, our spectrum. And so, that I think is an important part of understanding, perspective and bias, is knowing that if our brain is wired to say, us versus them, because it wants to put people and things in categories, but yet that's not reality, right? And so if we can just open ourselves, maybe a hint back to Lord, if we can have that openness
Yeah.
to recognizing that there's not like the concept of binary, whether it's the stories that are told, or there's always some fluidity. And so, anyway, that's sorry.
Beautifully said. Beautifully said. And and as I'm listening to you talk, I'm just realizing the relevance of all of this to healthcare. We have the poor historian is an actual term that people use all the time when they write in their medical notes. Someone comes in and they tell a wonky story, they write poor historian. effectively just marginalizing the story and shunting it into that category of indecipherable. Um, Maybe as a warning to future providers, like, hey, I didn't get it either.
Wow.
And instead
Wow.
of staying with the trouble, instead of really letting yourself be with the mystery of this crazy narrative and to sink in and to wonder and to be curious and to ask questions and above all to see the human telling it as somebody very much like yourself who is incapable of knowing themselves completely and might actually be doing the work to know themselves better by telling this funky story. That's something else
Mm,
in our reading.
yes.
Like the
Yes.
what is it? Identity is both declared and created with narrative. Like you don't figure out who you are
Yes.
until you have to write it down. That's why all these crazy reflective writing
That's right.
at home because it's like I did not know I knew that about myself. You know.
Right.
Um,
Right.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Thank you so much, Amy. This has been such a fun conversation. I know we could probably keep talking for hours. So thank you for joining me, for bringing your teacher's eye, your I know you teach not just English, but you teach in the health world as well. Thank you for bringing your storyteller's voice to this conversation too. And thank you for everybody who's listening. Next week, we will be turning toward temporality and the lived experience of pain, asking how time bends and shifts in relationship to suffering and how we can and how we can become more attuned to others' lived experiences of time. So I'll just leave everybody with this question. What happens when we measure time not by the clock, but by the body? Thank you so much for tuning in. Amy, stick around. We'll see you later.
Yes. All right. Take care. Thank you. Bye.